الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. This is lesson number 4 of our lessons on the best of stories, in which we're looking at an explanation of Surah Yusuf, the 12th chapter of the Qur'an. And we left Prophet Yusuf after he had refused the aggressive overtures of the wife of his patron. And this was a matter that occurred privately, and it should have stayed private, but it became public. So today we're going to see in the first part, in verses 30 to 35, the news of this attempted courtship spreading, and the wife of his patron, known frequently in the Islamic tradition as Zulaykha, she getting outraged by this and her response, leading up to Yusuf's imprisonment. Then we're going to look at Prophet Yusuf's time in prison, and then the king's dream and Yusuf's interpretation of that dream. So in the first of the parts that we're going to look at today, which is verses, so we're going to go today from verse 30, inshallah, till verse 49. So news of the attempted courtship spread. So that women in the city said that the nobleman's wife tried to court a young man in their household because she was overcome by love for him. And it says, and we surely see her clearly misguided. So here, and then she heard their gossip, right? When she heard about their gossip and their plotting, she called them all. She got outraged, she called them all. And she faced them, right? One by one, and gave each a knife, and said to Joseph, come forth to him, come forth to them. This would of course appear, so we don't know clearly when was he freed. When was he freed? Right? And some of the ulama argue that he wasn't freed till much later. Why? Because if he was a free man and an adult, once this controversy happened, etc., he could have just left. But her forcing him to come in front of them would appear to, would be one of the signs that he was still though treated well by his patron, was still in his, under his ownership. So she said to him, come out to them. When they saw Joseph, they were amazed by him, and they're so overcome that they actually cut themselves with the knives and said, no, by God, this is not a human. This could only be a noble angel in his dazzling beauty. Right? So then she said, this is what you blame me about. Says, and yes, I did try to court him for myself, but he sought shelter. But then she said, now if he doesn't do what I sought from him, I will make sure that he is imprisoned, and he'll be of those who are humiliated. So Joseph's first response is to turn to God. He says, O Lord, prison is more pleasing to me than what they call me to, which is public indecency. Now she wants me to have relations with her in front of all these ladies. It's even worse than the first case. Right? And if you don't turn away their plotting from me, I will be overcome by them. Because you're just one man, and there's all these, so now just in her rage, she wanted him right there in front of these ladies. Of course, we don't know the number, etc. And I would be of those who err if you don't protect me. So his Lord answered his prayer, and he turned away their plotting. Because though they did imprison him, they did not in any way breach his dignity there and then. Indeed, he is the hearing and the knowing. And then it occurred to them after a while, when they saw the signs, that he should be imprisoned for a long time. So these are the verses that we're going to look at. First, at verses 30 to 35. Right? One of the things that we see from verse 30 is the harmful nature of gossip. Right? Initially, the problem was over. She had a moment. He lived in their household, right? So she had a moment's temptation, but he protected himself. She got caught, and it was over. It doesn't appear that she was going to do anything about it after that. Okay? Her husband told her, repent to your Lord, and it's done. But it leaked. Right? It leaked. And this tells us about the really harmful nature of gossip, which is why our beloved Prophet ﷺ said that the talebearer shall not enter paradise. The talebearer, the one who discloses private matters. Because it turns something small that can be dealt with and it can be healed, it rips open the wound. It rips open the wound and makes it far, far worse. Okay? And so the harm of the one who conveyed it, but then also the people who was conveyed to, because they started gossiping. Right? They started gossiping, and they also exaggerated, because we don't have clear evidence that she was madly in love with him, but they described her that she was completely in love with him. Whereas what happened was a moment of temptation. Okay? So you see also that the nature of gossip is also that it's inflationary. It took one incident and it says she is madly in love with him. It would not appear to have been the case. And she says, and we see that she is completely misguided. Again, she made one mistake. That she's completely misguided. And again, that does not appear to be the case. She made one mistake. So this is also, they said this is social hypocrisy, right? People like looking very dignified. Oh, poor lady, right? But it's hypocrisy. There says, oh, we see her as really lost, but this is a hypocritical politeness. That's poor lady, yeah. But they just want to put her down. The politeness is just a mask. We also see that then of course, when she heard about their gossip, she reacted in a very harmful manner. And this is part of, the reality that, that when people are attacked, they're slandered, they're put down, etc., then, we ourselves have to be very careful when provoked, right? Because the human being is a rational animal, right? When we stop acting on the basis of our reason or even higher motives with our spiritual heart, then what are we? If the human being is a rational animal, if we take out reason or spirit, we're just animals. Right? We're just animals. And when provoked, we will do ugly things. And that's very dangerous. And what she did was very ugly. She said, okay, I'll show you. And the response, she herself, if she were told, should someone do this? Had she been calm, rational, she of course would have said, of course not. Who would do something like this? But she put together this really bizarre scenario. Right? So it tells us about the harms of anger, right? And also the harms of provoking people into, you corner somebody, how they'll react. But we also see that when provoked, there's a difference between, if someone is attacked, between defending oneself and defending one's self. Defending oneself meaning that if you're wronged, you protect your own rights. Right? You don't allow yourself to be wronged. And so you protect yourself. You protect your rights. But protecting yourself is, i.e., responding with the dictates of your lower self, your ego. You respond with anger, with whim, with malice, with vengeance. Right? And we see an example, very harmful example from that, where she tried to essentially publicly rape a dignified man, and failing that, she had him wrongfully imprisoned. Right? So we see there this danger that in a situation where if someone is wronged, that they have a right to defend themselves, but that's completely different from defending just your animal self, right? The lower self, the ego. You also see the harms of the unrestrained self here, right? This, our mere animal nature, right? That when provoked, we see manifestations here of envy, of malice, of vindictiveness, and this is pure harm, especially when the human animal self, sometimes the animal self within us can be relatively harmless, right? Gluttony, right? It's not immediately harmful. Just that I feel like another pizza. So, okay, you had pizza before the class, you grab another pizza. You didn't hurt or harm anyone. Long term, it's probably not the best way to be healthy, but it's not obviously harmful in the immediate. Right? So sometimes our whimsical desires, someone, they have an early appointment the next day, but they stay up till 3 in the morning. Why? Just because. It's not immediately harmful. You didn't do something terrible, but there's later harmful consequences. But the self, especially when angered, and it leads to all these harms. So there's obvious lessons for us. When provoked, be careful, right? Be careful. And these, it also tells about harmful company, right? About harmful company, that whatever these ladies that she brought weren't exactly the most virtuous of people, it would appear. Insofar as what did they, their response was very much driven themselves by their own lustful self rather than what what any kind of dignified response there, a modest response, a principled response would entail. Okay? And the scholars mention interestingly that, given that she was married and presumably somewhat older, given that they took him into their company when they're already been married. Now Yusuf's become a young man, so she wouldn't be a young woman anymore. So these other ladies were presumably also married and in their middle age. Right? So, but we see from that the harm of bad company. Okay? That the company you keep affects you. Right? Affects you. That we don't know why exactly she responded. Was it pure temptation? But the company you keep. You hang out with people who are always talking about their desires and this and that and lusting over other people and so on. So you may not act upon it immediate, but when there's a trigger, right, like it happened to the nobleman's wife, Zulaykha. So there's the immediate trigger. She didn't control herself then, but this background, that the spark only lights, the tinder that's already ready there. So this is, an obvious reminder for ourselves. So they responded with this amazement that this is not a human, this is but a noble angel. And is this just responding to his physical beauty? Or is it that Allah Most High, this is part of divine protection, that God manifested the dazzling beauty of this noble servant of his, this prophet of Allah to them, so they were dazzled, so that is part of a divine protection as well. Right? The divine protection, because what she wanted, her intentions were far worse than this. Right? And then she defends herself further, that this is what you blame me about. Right? This is what you blame me about. Right? I did court him for myself, but he refused. But now if he doesn't do what I command him, I will have him imprisoned and humiliated. Right? And this is her threat. But you see the response of principle, right? What does he do? One, of course, he refuses. He refuses, but more so, the first thing he does is he turns to his Lord. And this is the way a lordly servant responds. Okay? As the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, taught, if you be mindful of God, God will be mindful of you. Be mindful of God, you will find him before you. If you ask God. And if you rely upon God. Or if you seek assistance, seek God's assistance. So in this case, first thing he does is, even before he tells them, don't this, that, he turns to his Lord. Says, "O Lord, prison would be more pleasing to me than what they are calling me to. And if you don't turn them away from me, I will, be entrapped by them, and I will indeed fall into error." And this is a key, a key to strength in these testing situations is to turn to turn first inwardly to Allah, right? And to recognize one's weakness. To recognize one's weakness, that I can't do it myself. And that gives one strength, because one realizes that one's strength is by one's Lord. Right? So that's also empowering, because you say, well, how do I handle this? I'm one person and there's so many around. You feel very often this idea of self-confidence is actually very confidence depleting. I can do it. Me versus all these people, right? And even if you try, you feel very overwhelmed and think, but the servant of Allah sees the reality that there is, the Prophet ﷺ said that لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله كنز من كنوز الجنة. To affirm and realize that there's no ability nor power except through Allah is a treasure of the treasures of paradise. And it's empowering, because you say it's not that I can do it, I can deal with this, but rather the believer derives their confidence through their Lord. And that's just cause to have confidence, because you can't do it. You're weak. How can you really feel confident unless you delude yourself, right? So this is his turning, right? And this is one of the critical things in testing situations. And it also gives one calm. You don't have to react in the moment. You can pause, turn to Allah first, seek His help, and then respond. Okay? Respond how? Don't worry about the people and the circumstances. Ask what response will be most pleasing to Allah. What response is the right response? Okay? And then follow it, reliant upon your Lord. If it means, and very often people don't do things like this. Like, for example, it's one of those really shocking things. Someone's being, bullied. Well, there's 10 of them, there's one of me, should I say something? There's 10, and the question the believer asks is, what's the right thing to do? So maybe you step back a bit so you're not like, you could flee if they're, like when I was getting married, my wife asked me way too many questions. She says, okay, you want to live downtown? What if some big strong men start running after me? And she's born and raised in Oakville, suburbs, really nervous about living downtown Toronto. If they're big enough, I'll just tell you which way to run. Right? I'm not gonna stand there, but it gives us the strength to have the right response. And the divine response, of course, is immediate. Right? So his Lord responded, and he turned away their plotting, even though what she wanted was for him, was to have him there and then, and that was dispelled. That was dispelled. He turned away their plotting, and he truly is, as the verse continues, he truly is the hearing and all-knowing. Right? He truly is the hearing and the all-knowing. Now everyone turns to God in distress, but the Prophet, peace and blessing upon him, in the same hadith, in the same text that we quoted earlier, he advised that تعرف إلى الله في الرخاء يعرفك في الشدة. Come to know God when times are good, and He will know you in distress. Right? There's difference between the call of the one who is distant. God will respond, but there's difference between the response of one who is distant and one who is close. Right? One who is close, who has that closeness of relationship with God. Right? And he can. But the divine response is immediate, but things don't unfold in the way that you imagine. Because what happened in their case, then after she and them gave up on the idea of attacking him right there, then they decided, after the signs became clear of his virtue and dignity, that let's throw him in jail. Right? So they accused him of whatever, and they had him imprisoned for a long time. Right? And this is also a reminder, right, that tests and tribulations happen to the best of people, right? That, okay, he was innocent, right? God protected him in some ways, but doesn't mean that he'll be protected in every way. And also, not all trials are bad for one. A woman came to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and said that, O Messenger of Allah, I'm a woman who gets fits, and she gets some kind of convulsive fits. Ask Allah that He heal me of them. And he didn't pray for her. He said, he gave her a choice. He said, if you wish, I can pray for you to be healed of it. And if you wish, you can be patient and you shall have paradise. She said, I'll be patient, but when I have these fits, sometimes I get uncovered in public. So just ask Allah that I not get uncovered in public. He prayed for that. But he didn't pray for her to be healed of it. And this is the Prophet of God. Why? Because not everything that we dislike is actually bad for us. Right? Not everything that we dislike is necessarily bad for us. So the immediate harm and the resulting indignity, social at least, of him being publicly raped or attacked or whatever, he was protected of that. But he got thrown in prison for a lengthy period of time. And we're not told exactly how long it ended up being, but that's an important aspect. And this is one of the many wisdoms of the stories of the prophets that are in the Qur'an, and why we should, that no prophet, there's no smooth, there's no happy story of the prophets in the Qur'an. Right? Like in the tradition of the prophet. Which prophet, he had a happy childhood, grew up with a good, calm life. A few challenges happened, but a heroic, victorious narrative. Right? The number of prophets raised by a single parent with tribulation and fear and, getting thrown in a well, getting imprisoned, getting tortured, all kinds of things. And the embodiment of tests and our own prophet, peace and blessings upon him, he lost his father before even being born. And then his mother when he was an infant. Then his grandfather was taking care of him, he died. Then his uncle, and just one test after the other, right? And that shows us that ultimately this world is not where one finds one's ultimate joy, right? Or it's not in worldly things, at least, that one finds ultimate joy. So then, in the next part, verses 36 to 42, we're going to look at Yusuf's time in prison. Sometimes the nature of the Quranic narrative, that it's not telling us, its purpose is not to tell us a story in just a narrative fashion. So he went to prison. Where was the prison? How many prisoners were there? Okay. What was his prison cell like? So if you read literature, right, this is the best of stories, but if you consider the standards of stories, what's the narrative stuff? We don't get any information about the prison, the place or the size or the color or anything. Because the Qur'an has this radical focus on guidance. So then they decided that he'd be in prison for a while. He entered prison with two young men. Right? With two young men. Right? Either two young men or two servants, two other servants. A feta, which is translated here as servants, could also refer to two young men. They entered prison with him. And of course, a lot is omitted, right? But we do see from this that they entered prison with him. They weren't part of his case, right? So they're not directly related to him. But in the time in prison, they clearly grew to trust him. Because you have to have a certain level of trust in somebody to ask him to interpret your dream. Right? So one of them said that I see myself. Right? I saw myself pressing wine. And the other said, I saw myself carrying above my head dry bread that birds were plucking off my head. Tell us about the interpretation of this, for we see you to be of the virtuous, al-muhsineen, of those who do good. Right? So they grew to trust him, right? Even though he was falsely accused, right, of indecency. He got imprisoned. But ultimately, right, even if someone is wrong, if they're a virtuous person, they will be respected despite what the chattering classes may state. Right? So it said, we truly see you as someone who does good. Right? And they say that it's come. Ibn Kathir mentions that if you look at the biblical tradition, in prison, Sayyidina Yusuf, Joseph, peace be upon him, was known for his generosity. And his preferring the other prisoners to himself. He was also known for his trustworthiness, right? His dignity, his truthfulness, right? His dignified conduct, and his devotion, right? That he was very worshipful, right? So they were impressed with that, and that a person's conduct is a lot more expressive than what people say long term, right? Which also reminds us, right, that true honor is in being honorable. It's not just in seeking. It's not, people's stated respect is fickle. You try to get people to like you, etc. It's very fickle. But if you are virtuous, you're noble, you do good, then long term you'll be vindicated, both in a worldly sense, but ultimately that's what counts with Allah. So he didn't respond right away. He didn't respond right away. He says that that the food won't come to feed you except that I will have told you about the interpretation of this dream. Right? So this is from his circumspection. And that's part of what gives trust. He didn't say, okay, here's the answer. He said, I'll answer you by the time the food comes to you. And he reminds them that this is from what my Lord has taught me. That I don't claim to have this knowledge. This is a gift from God. Right? So, and this is one of the important etiquette of a believer is to be circumspect, not to be hasty. Even if you know the answer, you don't have to rush it right now. Right? Unless someone needs it immediately, so okay, let's talk about this. Right? And it makes them take it seriously too. Right? Because if it's something important, right? That's why one of the great early Imams of Islam, Imam Malik ibn Anas, was the leading scholar of the city of Medina, the city of the Prophet, peace and blessings upon him, in the 2nd century of Islam. If people came to ask him something about the Prophet, peace and blessings upon him, he would take it very seriously. They just asked him while walking. He said, come to my home. Come to the mosque. Let's sit down. Right? Because this is something serious. Right? And this is both for the importance of the matter, but also for the person to benefit from it. And that sometimes, even in our day-to-day, someone is asking about something really big. You just tell them on the fly, how seriously are they going to take it? And suddenly you know the answer. Right? So you have a friend, he keeps getting mad at his wife. So what do I do? So the answer is simple, don't just get mad all the time. But you just tell them in passing, will they listen? They won't take it so seriously, but very often the experience shows, they say, why don't we get together over a cup of coffee? And then you talk about it, then they'll approach it, they'll take the same answer a lot more seriously. So you see his circumspection. He said, well, yeah, by the time the food comes, I'll have given you the answer. But also ascribing blessings to one's Lord. Right? Ascribing blessings to one's Lord. This is from the etiquette of a believer as well. It says, this is from what my Lord has taught me. Right? And then he expresses gratitude. Right? And that gratitude also, because as a caller to God, as a prophet of God, right, his purpose isn't simply mundane, that just to give them an interpretation of a worldly dream. His purpose is to call them to God. Right? So he says, I'll interpret your dream, but this is from what my Lord has taught me. I used to be from a community of people, a community who do not believe in God and who deny the hereafter. Right? So this is from his reminding, where does this good come from? Where is this virtue from? It says, and I have followed the way of my forefathers, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And it is not for me to associate any partners with God in anything. It says, this is from the bounty of my Lord upon us. And this is from the bounty or the favor of God upon us and upon all people. But most people are not grateful. Okay? But most people are not grateful. So he's sitting in prison, right, with some, with other prisoners. He said, this is from the bounty of my Lord, right, upon us and upon all people. But most people are not grateful. Right? And this reminds that, the nature of realizing one's being a servant of God, that it frees you from being in the servitude of any other person or any other consideration. That you see the good even in a difficult situation, even while you're taking the means to get out of it. Okay? But even in that situation, but most people aren't grateful. But who's worse off than someone who's stuck in prison? Right? But he sees that the joy of being or realizing one's being a servant of God removes these sorrows, and then he addresses them. And of course they were receptive. And they were receptive because we saw that they were respectful of him. They recognized good in them. But they didn't understand, why is he talking to them now about this? Because they expressed that we see you as being a virtuous person. We see you as someone who does good. So now he'll be helpful to them. He'll interpret their dream. But he's explaining to them, what is the source of this virtue? It's not that I'm some special guy. I'm a servant of God. Let me tell you about it. Right? Because this is out of his sincere concern for their good. So he tells them, my dear companions, here in prison, is are many, many different lords better, or the one, or God, the one, the overwhelming? And because one has a choice in life, right? That are you going to serve one Lord, or are you going to be in servitude to all kinds of things? Right? Whether or not you worship them or not. Right? It says, my companions here in prison is having many lords, many masters better, or God, the one, the overwhelming. Right? So this reminds us of, what is the focus? And this very often when people talk about Islam, right? People say, okay, well, I'm a Muslim. We do this and this and this, and no, it's very clear from how the prophets talk to people about religion, that the point of religion is not a whole set of actions. That, well, who is a believer? Who's a Muslim? What is Islam? A whole bunch of things. Actually, bad marketing too. What are Muslims? Well, we get up before the sun's even up and we pray. After washing ourselves with water, cold water even on a winter morning. And then we pray again at work, and we pray at the end of work, and we pray when we get home, we pray before we go to sleep. And we go hungry for a month. And we go to a place you haven't heard about in the Middle East, and we give away some of our wealth. What's wrong with you guys? Right? And we dress funny, and right? But none of it, and it might be attractive to some people. Say, well, that gives me discipline in my life. It gives me structure. But that's not the point of the whole thing. Why is all of this taking place? Because of the reality of God, that God exists, and God is worth being devoted to. How is one devoted to God? These are the means. The means are not denied, but means only have meaning if they have a purpose. But the prophets called people to the path of submission by focusing on the one they were calling to God. Right? And this is one of the important lessons in this for each of us. Even in our day-to-day, when people talk, okay, so why do... And many people are curious about Islam. Right? So, and sometimes there is a need for a little bit of PR. So, well, as a Muslim community, we're peaceful, and we're shining happy people, whatever, public relations are needed, but why are you guys doing what you're doing? Okay? It's important also to be very clear that, who are we? We're not just Muslims because that's our identity. We're not just Muslims because, well, my parents are Muslims. We're not just Muslims because of whatever random reasons we come up with. We're Muslims because this is whom we believe in. Okay? And this is what that belief means in our lives. So then he says, and all that you worship, all that you are devoted to, besides God, are nothing but names that you have named. Whether these are other idols you worship, they're just names. Okay? They're just constructs that you and your forefathers have named, which God has given no permission regarding. Okay? And this applies to devotion to other deities, but also applies to the things people devote themselves to. Many people are slaves to their own work. Right? They're slaves to it. They're devoted to it like someone would be devoted to a deity. Other people are devoted to fame. And it's just a name. There's nothing more to it. Other people are completely devoted to certain modes of entertainment. You could argue that a lot of binge watching is a type of devotion. In the old days, people used to take time out and go into seclusion. They say for 2 days, 3 days, they were engaged for much of the day in worship. There's people who binge watch over a weekend. They watch a whole, they watch 3 seasons. Someone explained how they watched 30 hours of, I don't know what show, Friday evening, Saturday and Sunday. Because I had to. I just sat, listen, I didn't ask too many questions. Why? Because I had to catch up before whatever new season was starting. Okay? That's worship. That's a different kind. But what is it? It's just names. And what meaning does it have? What ultimate benefit does it have? None. Right? In al-hukmu illa lillah. Because true command is only God's. Right? And what did He command? He commanded that you worship, i.e., that you be devoted only to Him. Right? Because that's what counts. And what does He seek from you? He seeks good from you. Good in your relationship with Him, but also that you be a means for good around you. That be a means of good in your family, be a means of good in your neighborhood, be a means of good in your community, be a means of good to His creation. Right? And He has commanded that you be devoted only to Him. That is upright religion. But most people are unaware of this. So this is His reminder to them. Right? This is their reminder to them. The upright religion is to strive to be sincere in seeking the pleasure of God, both in one's devotion and life. That's what some of the early Muslims explained. That is upright religion, is that one be sincere in one's devotion to God, but also in all one's worldly dealings. To be sincerely seeking the pleasure of God in all of them. Okay? So that's his plea to them. And then he says, my dear companions in prison, ya sahibay as-sijn. Okay? And they're from very different backgrounds, etc. They're presumably locals. He's actually not an Egyptian himself. Like he was just transported there. But my dear companions in prison. Then he interprets the dream for them. As for one of you, they will give wine to drink to their Lord, or to their master. As for the other, they will be crucified, and then birds will eat from his head. Said, this is the resolution of the matter that you asked me about. And that's the resolution of the matter that you asked me about. And this the interpretation of dreams is recognized, and the Prophet, peace and blessings on him, taught about it. But dreams should not be overemphasized, right? That they have a place. Not all dreams have a meaning of spiritual significance or even worldly significance. A lot of people are very superstitious about dreams, and the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said that a dream can never harm one in any way. If one has a bad dream, one should just seek refuge in God and have complete trust in Him, and it could not hurt one. And very often, dreams, bad dreams, nightmares arise out of our fears and insecurities, or because of uncertainties that one is facing. But that's from divine mercy, that bad dreams would not. But if there's a positive dream, right, one takes a good meaning from it and asks God that He fulfill that meaning. And then Yusuf said to his then Yusuf said to the one that he thought would be saved from amongst them, remember me with your master. Remember me with your master. Because they're both deeply grateful that he interpreted their dream. Now one, he thought this one will be let go early, because they're still in prison. That this one will be saved, will be let go. But the devil made him forget to mention Joseph with his Lord, with his master. So Joseph remained in prison for many years. What does your translation mention? How many years? It mentioned for several years. Yeah. For several years. So he languished, and again, how many years was it? It's not a matter of great consequence. It's not mentioned. Now you see here that Joseph's contentment, his acceptance of what God destined from him, where he's placed him, does not mean that he's not taking the means, right? So and this is the way of the believer, that while he is content, he is grateful, right? He's made good where he's at that moment, but he's proactively taking the means to make things better for himself in a worldly sense. So this person that he talked to, he wasn't being let out of prison, right? It wasn't known that he's going to be let out of prison, but he was proactive, right? But there's a difference between having trust in God and having contentment, and then taking the means out of a sense of desperation and fear and being unsettled, and that's unbecoming the believer. And that's why faith, if certitude, gives one calm and contentment, but that calm and contentment does not mean passiveness. Rather, the believer is someone who actively seeks those outcomes that are most pleasing to God. Right? And this is a clear example of that. So, he interpreted the dream. They're very grateful. One of them leaves prison. But he forgets about telling the king about Joseph and to let him out. Now, it would appear that the king is other than his master. And because then in the next part we see the king's dream and Yusuf's interpretation of it. So Yusuf's patron is referred to as Al-Aziz, the nobleman. The nobleman. Some of the scholars said he was the ruler of Egypt. But most of the scholars said no, he was amongst the ruling classes. So was a person of nobility, but the king was other than his own master. And so the king related his dream, we're at verse 43, addressing his, the circle of advisors around him. The king said, and again you see this Quranic style, and sometimes you have to pause and think, okay, what's being said? And one of the wisdoms in this is to urge, you are not forced to, but the nature of the Quranic narrative is you need to reflect. Right? Because if all the details were filled in, do you really have to think much? No. So the nature of the Quranic narrative is, it's structured in a way that if you're not thinking, it sort of forces you. The king said. Anyway, if someone says, then the king said, well, the king's not in prison, so who did he say it to? Right? So it forces you to, number one, to focus, number two, to think. And then one benefits from the guidance, and that's it. But also makes the Qur'an stays fresh that way. That have you ever thought to yourself that I'm so tired of reading the Surah Al-Fatiha in every cycle of the prayer? You feel tired of it? Do you? No. But that's from the marvel of the Qur'an. If someone sat back and said, okay, I've been reciting the Qur'an, I've been praying for the last 30 years of my life. That's 365 days in a year. That's what? 10,000 days. 50,000 obligatory prayers. Plus. Yes, the obligatory prayers. 50,000 obligatory prayers. At least that's over 100,000 cycles. 150,000 cycles. Plus a bunch of voluntary prayers, not too many. 200,000 times. Just within the prayer, I've recited the opening chapter of the Qur'an. Does it ever get boring? Never like, oh, I have to say this again. And every time, and there is part of it from the oral beauty of it, also from the rhetorical beauty of it, and then it's divine grace, and there's that's from the gift of the Qur'an. Right? So here the king said. Okay? So now we've shifted from. It doesn't say then. It just skips. And one of the marvels of this also is the only one who can speak like this is God Himself. This is not, even those in the time of the Prophet, peace and blessings upon him, wanted to attack this. They said, well, it's not human speech. Because no one would dare, even if you read like magical realism or any kind of modern literature, nobody would try to say the kind of things that are in the Qur'an because stylistically you can't get away with it. But if you're God, you can do whatever you want. And it's powerful, and it's not confusing. Right? And that's from the marvel of the Qur'an. So the king said, I see 7 cows, 7 fat cows, being eaten by 7 thin cows. And 7, what does it say? And 7 green ears of grain, and other 7 ears that are dry. Said, O company, tell me about my vision, my dream, if you are of those who can interpret dreams. Right? So this seems very strange, right? 7 fat cows being eaten by 7 thin cows, 7 green grains being stalks of wheat being, and 7 others that are dry. What's that all about? Right? So someone just said that. They said, Adghathu ahlam. These are just wayward dreams, strange, made-up dreams. And we don't know about interpreting dreams anyways. Right? These are baseless dreams. Don't worry about it. But the king felt that there was a significance to the dream. Right? The king felt that there's a significance to the dream. So the advisors around the king, who were presumably, like in court, you'd have, these were the learned individuals around the king, they said, we have no knowledge. Presumably the man who was in prison was not amongst those advisors, but he was there, possibly a servant, right? Possibly a servant. Right? So the one who was saved amongst them, was saved, meaning was saved from prison, and he remembered after a long time, years, says, I will tell tell you about the interpretation of this dream. But you have to let me go, because he's in service, right? I know how to get this dream interpreted, but you have to let me go, because, and that's why they say it's probably because he was in service. I'll need some time, I have to make some arrangement. And the king was sufficiently concerned that he allowed it. Now, how did this servant go from the king's court to prison and enter, and a whole bunch of things have happened? Because now suddenly the focus shifts from the palace of the king. The king was with his advisors, and the servant presumably is there around. And he says, I know the interpretation, but you'll have to let me go. Verse 46, he says, Yusuf, dear friend. Right? Now, presumably, he probably apologized. Because a bit of a slip. Someone was so good to you, and oops, I forgot. Right? But that too is omitted. Right? Yusuf, dear friend, tell us about 7 fat cows being eaten by 7 thin cows, and 7 stalks of green, 7 green stalks, and other 7 that are dry. So that it may be that I may return to the people, and so they may find out. So they may find out. Now, having witnessed, how does he know that this dream, how does this servant know that this dream has significance? The ulama said that just by the single interpretation, the interpretation of his dream and the other prisoner's dream, that probably wouldn't have been enough to give him conviction that Yusuf knows what he's talking about. But he's witnessed the truth of his dreams, but they say that Joseph in prison was interpreting the prisoner's dreams. Because people had come to trust him. So he'd seen it again and again, that he was able to interpret dreams, and things turned out in the way that he had interpreted. So that people may know, they may recognize that you're someone special. So he explained. He said that you will. Now again here, this is from Joseph's selflessness. Right? In this situation, he said, well, let me negotiate my release. I will answer on condition that you do these things. I need to be released. I need to be exonerated. I want this much in damages, and I this, and I that, and I this. He saw this dream is of public significance. So he answered the dream first. He answered the dream first. Why? Because none of you, the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, tells us, none of you believes until they wish for others of the good that they wish for themselves. Okay? The righteous believers are described in the Qur'an that they وَيُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ, they prefer others to themselves, even if what they have is meager indeed. So he's in prison. They ask him for, this is like, he could negotiate pretty much whatever he wanted at that time. But this is from his nobility. Now, of course, you could negotiate the best of agreements that you want, but you see, a prophetic standard. So he explains, you will harvest for 7 years reliably. Right? It says, but what you harvest, keep it in its stalks, except a little of what you consume. So let it grow. And then after that will come 7 years that are difficult. You will eat, they will consume what you sent forth before, except a little of what you have stored up. Right? And this is, so he said that you have 7 years of plenty. So don't consume it all. Only take a little and save up the rest. Let the crop grow and store it up. Because then, after that, a year will come when people will be in distress. And in that year, they will be in real difficulty. Right? So he advised them that you'll have good years, so save in those good years. Right? Why? Because human beings have been created hasty by nature, even as individuals. So when times are good, people actually end up spending more than they have, because times are good, we've got lots of access to money and this and that, so they'll actually end up spending more than they have. One of the shocking things that I realized, because when we started the new series, all these doctor friends, they just came up, they didn't even reach out to them. Said, we'd love to help it. I'm so over leveraged and so stressed out. And they're like, some of them actually, billing in the millions each year, but they're like, I'm on the verge of bankruptcy. Why? Because, that's just the nature of people, but countries do the same thing. And when times are good, and very often, and this something applies, we have elections coming up, that very often we don't look long term. And we want policy. Everyone wants, everyone says we care about the environment, but we don't want to pay a cent more for it. Everyone says, we should eat organic. We're not going to pay for it. Why? Because the immediate seems so much more real. That's the nature of the human being. So he said, no, this dream is telling us, as a nation, that 7 years of plenty will come. Let the vegetation grow, only consume with restraint and store the rest, and then a year will come of distress, and then you'll need that. Right? And then of course, the prisoner relates this back to the king. Right? The prisoner relates that back to the king. Now the question is, how did Joseph know the interpretation of these dreams? This is from, different prophets were given different types of honorific miracles. And this is from the honorific miracle granted Prophet Joseph is the interpretation of dreams. And God chose that the king himself would have this auspicious dream that really stuck in his head, and Joseph had the answer to it. So then we will see how Joseph, in the next lesson, how Joseph returned back, was freed from the prison, and he was honored because things played out in the way that he had interpreted. So there's many lessons in these 20 verses that we've looked at regarding our own conduct, how we respond to adversity, God's protection for those who turn to God first in tests and trials. But that God's protection does not mean that everything will be, shiny and easy, but that we've been created to toil and struggle. Okay? But the believer is one who toils and struggles with trust in God, with certitude, but while taking the means, right? And we see his being proactive. Say, well, let's see what happens. That trust in God is not fatalism. But people who make a difference, like Joseph here, he did not make his concern for the people conditional on his self-interest, and that's what makes people great, right? When they truly care for the good of others. We ask Allah Most High that He grant us of that concern. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi. Any questions?